Morning, everybody. I'm sorry I can't be with you. I'm sure you've been told already I've got COVID, but I'd prepared the sermon, so it made sense for me to do a recording rather than somebody else having to prepare from scratch. So we're here at Palm Sunday, and some of you with very good memories might remember I preached on Palm Sunday back in November when we were working through Mark's Gospel. I've decided we'll go for Matthew's Gospel this time, just to give us a slight change, although the accounts are very similar. Before we start looking at that passage, though, let's just set the scene and look at what was happening in Jerusalem at that time and what Jesus and the disciples were doing. Got this quote from Charles Spurgeon: "The more you read the Bible and the more you meditate upon it, the more you'll be astonished with it. You will find the scriptures enlarge as you enter them. The more you study them, the less you will appear to know of them, for they widen out as we approach them." That is certainly my experience coming back and looking at Palm Sunday again. There are things I've seen this time round that I didn't see the previous time round, and I do just come to realise how little I know, but I will share what I do know with you. It's such a joy reading God's Word and just letting His Spirit speak to us through it and show us things. So let's set the scene a little bit for Palm Sunday. So Jesus and the disciples were travelling up from Jericho, climbing up that road to Bethpage and Bethany, the villages on the Mount of Olives. From the top of the Mount of Olives is a little bit higher than the mount that Jerusalem and the Temple are on, but you could look across the Kidron Valley and see the city of Jerusalem and the Temple itself. And here's a reconstruction of what it might have looked like at that time. It was no accident that Jesus was travelling to Jerusalem at the time of the Passover. Everything, the more you look at this passage, the more you realise God had a detailed plan in it all. Jews were coming from all over the country to celebrate the Passover festival. It was one of the 3 big annual festivals that they celebrated at the temple. And it commemorates freedom from slavery in Egypt. So Passover is the final plague, when Pharaoh finally says to Moses, "Take your people and go, get out." The Israelites were told to take a lamb and kill it and eat it, but to put the blood on their doorways, over the lintels. And then when God passed over the land, He would pass over their homes and they would be safe. He would see the blood. But of course the Egyptians weren't doing that, and the firstborn of the Egyptians were all killed by that plague. So Jesus is coming to Jerusalem at the time of celebrating this freedom from slavery and the sacrifice of the Passover lamb. And of course He is the Passover lamb. His blood will be shed to bring complete freedom once and for all, the ultimate sacrifice. So they'll no longer need the temple sacrifices made on a daily basis where blood was shed for the forgiveness of sins. Jesus is that Passover lamb. God has a plan in it all. Another thing to note is it's not very long since Lazarus has been raised from the dead. He's been raised to life. The crowds knew about this. Word had spread. And they knew that in the Old Testament there was a promise of a Messiah coming, someone who was going to set them free, someone who's going to rule on the throne of David. And they'd heard about Jesus. They'd heard about the healings. They'd heard that He cast out demons. And finally, He'd actually raised someone to life. So there was an expectation, a hope, that this Jesus might be the coming Messiah, the person who was going to free them from Roman occupation, from Roman rule, and restore the nation of Israel. Mixed in with that, they'd been aware of the nationalistic revolt by Judas Maccabeus, which was about 200 years before. At that time, Israel was occupied by the Syrians rather than the Romans, and the Syrians had put their own statues of Greek gods into the temple. Judas Maccabeus was the son of a Jewish priest, and he rallied troops around him and really carried out guerrilla warfare against the Syrians. So it was a military group that he gathered together to restore the nation, the nationhood of Israel. And he did manage to recapture the temple and restore the temple worship. And that's why the Jews celebrate the festival of Hanukkah in November, the festival of lights. It's commemorating that delivery by Judas Maccabeus and his troops from Syrian rule and the temple of Jerusalem. So that really colours, I think, the expectation of the crowds. They're looking for some sort of a military ruler who's going to bring back the national pride, bring back the national state. Of course, the Jewish authorities knew all about this. They'd had their eyes on Jesus over the last 3 years or so. And they'd been pushed and pushed. They'd seen the healings. They'd now heard that Lazarus had been raised to life. And in John's Gospel, we're told the Pharisees said, "See, the whole world has gone after him." Well, the Jewish authorities are not going to put up with that. And Jesus knows that. As he comes to Jerusalem, he knows what lies in store. But he also knows that his Father God has a plan. So let's read the passage together. Matthew chapter 21, verses 1 to 10. Many thanks to whoever did the reading for me. Let's look at the passage then and unpick it a little bit and see what the details are and what they mean, what the significance is of them. So to start with, Jesus sent 2 disciples saying, "Go to the village ahead of you. You'll find a donkey tied there and her colt. Untie them and bring them to me. If anybody asks you, say the Lord needs them." I mean, that's a bit odd to start with, isn't it? He's basically saying, go to the village, pinch a donkey, you might get away with it, but if anybody stops you, just say the Lord needs you. Lord needs them. It doesn't really seem to be the Christian way, does it? It's not quite what we expect. But maybe a point here is if Jesus is king, the king's prerogative was to commandeer beasts of burden. So if he's a king, he can take anybody's donkey, and he has absolute right to. It's not theft. In Mark's Gospel, it notes that the colt, the foal that he asked for, was to be unridden by anyone. And again, that might seem irrelevant, really. I mean, who cares if it's been ridden or not? But if Jesus is king, the tradition was nobody rode the king's animals, the horses, the donkeys. Only the king could ride them. So maybe, again, just another pointer towards his kingship. It's interesting that he chooses a donkey to ride on rather than a horse, a steed. But that's not unheard of for kings. When Solomon was anointed as king, David said to one of his servants, "Take my mule, take my donkey for Solomon to ride." So if kings were coming in peace, it was not unheard of for them to ride on a donkey. And then Matthew quotes this passage from the prophet Zechariah. "Say to daughter Zion, see your king comes to you gentle and riding on a donkey, and on a colt, the foal of a donkey." It's worth just having a quick look at that passage. It's Zechariah chapter 9. I'm just going to flick through it myself as I'm talking to you. If you don't know where it is, it's right at the end of the Old Testament before the book of Malachi. It's the last but one book. So Zechariah 9, verse 9. It's actually entitled "The Coming of Zion's King" in Zechariah. It says, "Rejoice greatly, daughter Zion. Shout, daughter Jerusalem. See, your king comes to you, righteous and victorious, lowly and riding on a donkey, on a colt, the foal of a donkey. So you could say Jesus is acting out that prophecy of around 500 years before. Zechariah was prophesying around 480 years before Christ was born. Or you could say Zechariah was foretelling what Jesus was going to do. But either way, it's a prophetic fulfillment of this passage here. Again, God has a plan. It's not accidental. He'd thought this one all out right from Zechariah's day, right from the time of the Passover and Moses, and earlier than that. Interestingly, that passage in Zechariah goes on to say of this king, I'll take away the chariots from Ephraim and the war horses from Jerusalem. The battle bow will be broken. He will proclaim peace to the nations, and his rule will extend from sea to sea and from the river to the ends of the earth. So it's a kingdom of peace where the weapons of war are broken, and his kingdom extends to the ends of the earth. And we'll come back to that in a little bit. But what Jesus is doing here, coming on a donkey, he's really demilitarizing the concept of Messiah that a lot of the crowd had. They were looking for that Judas Maccabeus figure, that military person who was going to defeat the Romans. And here comes Jesus in peace, humility, gentleness. It's not really quite what they had in mind. We're then told the disciples went and did as Jesus had instructed. They brought the donkey and colt, they placed their cloaks on them for Jesus to sit on them, and the very large crowd spread their cloaks on the road, while others cut branches from the trees and spread them on the road. It's a bit of an odd thing, putting your cloak on the ground, and I'm guessing a lot of that crowd only had one cloak, so it wasn't like they had a whole range of them and could just afford to throw one away. And it's not really the sort of thing you'd think of, is it? It's not our culture. If the Queen came to visit Dereham, I don't think I'd take my jacket off, my anorak off, and throw it on the ground. And I don't suppose she'd particularly want me to. But it was a sign, once again, of kingship. When we're told in 2 Kings chapter 9, when Jehu was anointed as king, his officers quickly took off their cloaks and put them on the ground. It was an acknowledgement, you are king. I am giving my allegiance to you. They've got these branches from the trees. And John mentions in his gospel palm branches specifically. Now this takes us back to the time of Judas Maccabee, the revolt 200 years earlier. Because when Judas Maccabee was defeating the Syrians who were occupying Jerusalem, we're told in the historical records the crowd waved palm branches. And the Jews actually put palm branches on their coins as a symbol of Jewish nationalism, of the Jewish state. So cutting these palm branches and waving branches seems quite a nice, jolly, sort of peaceful thing to do in celebration. But it has a little bit more significance than that. It's tied into this nationalistic fervour, this desire for the state of Israel to be restored, and they're looking for a Messiah, a king, to deliver them from Roman occupation and restore that state. As they did all this, the crowd shouted, Hosanna, save us, Son of David. Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. Now that's taken from Psalm 118, which I think might have been read during the worship. But that verse from Psalm 118 was sung daily during the Feast of Tabernacles, and it was well understood to mean it was talking about the coming Messiah. Blessed is the Messiah, the one who comes in the name of the Lord. Another quote from Charles Spurgeon. This riding through the streets of Jerusalem was as plain a manifesto and proclamation of his royal rights as could possibly have been issued. Jesus was acting out that prophecy of Zechariah and saying, I am king. The question is, what sort of a king? And how did that tie in with what the crowd were expecting? So the crowd were looking for a nationalistic, a military Messiah. They'd want a Judas Maccabeus coming in on a war horse. And they've got a Jesus riding on a donkey. Not very splendid, no sign of any military whatsoever. What they're expecting does not tie in with what they get. And ultimately, what they're expecting most definitely did not tie in with what they got. And maybe that's why so many of them deserted him during that Easter week. There's just a huge mismatch between what is expected and what they get. But also they completely misunderstand what they do get. Jesus comes to Jerusalem, he goes to the temple, and we're told the next day he goes back to the temple. And in that chapter of Matthew, I'm looking now at Matthew 21, verse 21, Jesus says, I tell you the truth, if you have faith and do not doubt, you can say to this mountain, go and throw yourself into the sea, and it will. And it's not saying you need to have faith in prayer and you can tell any mountain just to go and throw itself into the sea, although you could, and you do need faith in prayer. He's saying, Temple Mount, if you put your trust in me, put your faith in me, the temple has become irrelevant. I am the Passover lamb. I am the sacrifice once and for all. These daily sacrifices made by the priests are not needed anymore. The temple has become irrelevant. So Jesus has come as a king and the Passover lamb, the one who lays down his life for his friends, who goes to the cross, who suffers humiliation and agony. Not the king they were looking for at all. In that prophecy from Zechariah, it spoke of Jesus taking away the war horses from Jerusalem and proclaiming peace to the nations. It's a strange sort of king, a strange sort of ruler. No army, no visible army, no men with swords, no war horses, no bodies on the street, no burning of houses. Riding in peace, gentle on a donkey. It's not the world's vision of a military ruler and the ultimate king. It certainly wasn't the vision of the people in Jerusalem. It wasn't what they were looking for. But of course they completely missed the point. They were looking for freedom for the Jewish state, to restore the Jewish state and freedom from the Romans. But what Jesus was bringing was something so much bigger than that. Not just the Jewish state. His rule goes from Jerusalem to the ends of the earth. It's the whole world. The vision is so much bigger. The wonderful thing for us is that although that crowd there, or most of them, didn't see it, God has opened our eyes to see it and to see what a wonderful king and a wonderful kingdom we have. We're told in chapter 21 again that Jesus went to the temple and healed the blind and the lame. The very people who were excluded from the temple, Jesus welcomed them and he healed them. His kingdom is an inclusive kingdom. In the last 3 years of his life, he spent his time as a servant, travelling round, healing the sick, giving hope to the poor, challenging the authorities. And he's got to the end of his journey, the final week, pushing into Jerusalem. He knows he's heading for that cross. That's our King. That's our God. That's how much he loves us. Quote this time from Rowan Williams. The relationship of Jesus to the Father is not episodic. Jesus does not receive an occasional bit of instruction from the Father. His relationship is sustained, eternal, and unbroken. He gazes into the mystery of the Father's love and enacts it in heaven and on earth. Jesus, a King who comes in peace and humility and lays down his life for his friends. This is our King. This is who we worship, the servant King. The one who brings a kingdom of inclusion, not exclusion. The kingdom that includes the lame, the blind, the sick. It includes the refugee and the homeless. It includes the foreigner. It includes you, and amazingly, it includes me. That's our kingdom. That's our King. The question is, are we ready? Are we ready to lay down our cloaks and say, yes, we acknowledge your kingship in our lives? Are we ready to say, you can commandeer our donkey? I don't know if anyone's got a donkey in the congregation, but you can commandeer our stuff, our things, our money, our time, whatever we've got, our possessions. Are we ready to kneel in humility at his feet and say, you are King, you are God? Take me, whatever you want. I want to serve you. Servant King, I want to serve in your kingdom. So as we come through Easter week, Passion week, let's just spend some time kneeling before God and reflecting on who our King is and what our calling is in his kingdom. Bless you. Thank you for listening. I'm sure you're going to have a time of worship now, and I really wish I was with you to join in. But maybe you just want to kneel in front of a cross at the front of church, or go into one of the aisles and kneel. Just kneel in worship and awe at our King Jesus.